Everybody knows what a moonshot is. It's a big goal, an exciting destination. Everybody wants to do it. But if you look back, the big ideas, the truly important ideas, the ones that transformed industries or changed the course of science or even changed history, rarely arrive with blaring trumpets and red carpets dazzling everybody with their brilliance. They were usually dismissed for years or even decades, and their champions were written off as crazy. There wasn't a good word for that in the English language, so I made one up. Now, there are plenty of examples of those kinds of loonshots in history, whether it was jet engines or rockets or drugs for treating cancer or heart disease, and I write about some of those stories. But I want to tell you today about a really important one, a story that not many people know, and that is turtles. It can be very hard for people to understand why would someone kill a really promising, exciting idea like jet engines or a new drug for cancer. Why do good teams kill great ideas? So I want you to imagine that you are the head of a major movie studio, and I come to you with an idea. Here's my idea. Giant turtles. And they wear bandanas, and they carry swords, they love to fight, and listen to this. They eat lots of pizza. Right now, you probably would say that's the dumbest idea I've heard in the last 3 months. Get out of my office. But of course, that became Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, $6 billion franchise. So a moonshot is this big goal. We want to have the #1 studio in the world, or we want to have 10 #1 hits by the end of the year. But nurturing loonshots, those seemingly crazy ideas, is how we get there. So here's why this is so important, especially now, especially with all the things that have been happening in the last couple years. Everybody knows that the pace of technology change has been accelerating. What used to take 30 years or 20 years with radio and television now might take just 3 years or 2 years or even 6 months with social or TikTok. But what's even more important is that the pace of competition is accelerating. Why? Well, there's access to capital for entrants who small companies in a way that there never used to be, the rise of social and the rise of cloud services. All of those make it easier for new entrants to come into markets, which means those of us in existing businesses have to figure out, if we want to stay ahead and stay alive, how to innovate at a pace and scale that nobody's ever innovated before. So to do that, that's what I'm going to show you today. I'm going to tell you some very different ways of thinking about the behavior of teams and companies and groups. Why is it that groups will do seemingly very strange things? Why is it that good teams will kill great ideas? It's going to be a mix of physics, business, and history. And I'm going to be talking about structure rather than culture. I trained as a physicist in academic science, so the culture stuff has always felt kind of squishy to me anyway. After I was in physics for about 10 or 12 years, I started a biotech company developing new drugs for treating cancer. And not long after I started that biotech company, my father got diagnosed with a rare type of leukemia. And I figured, now I'm in the field, I can do something about this. I have access to all the latest science and scientists and experts in cancer drugs, which I did. But unfortunately, nothing I could do made any difference. My father died not long afterwards. And over the years, as our company grew and we went public, everywhere I looked, trapped inside the basement, large companies, small companies, were promising ideas that could have helped my dad. Not because any of the people involved were bad people, but because of something strange that happens when people come together into a group. All of which boils down to this one question. Why do good teams kill great ideas? Why do good teams kill great ideas? So to answer that question, in a way that's never been answered before in 200 years of people writing about organizations, I'm going to need a prop. This is a glass of water, and when I stick my finger inside and swirl it around, the molecules inside that glass just slosh around my finger. And that's always true for any liquid, except as I lower the temperature. Right at 32 Fahrenheit, boom, the behavior of those molecules suddenly changes. They go from sloshing around to totally rigid. And I can't put my finger inside anymore. The water freezes. Why? The molecules inside are exactly the same. So how did they know to suddenly change behavior? There was no CEO molecule with a bullhorn saying, oh, it's 33 Fahrenheit, everybody slosh around. Wait, it's 31, everybody line up and be rigid. They just do it. Why? So what I'll show you is how understanding the answer to that question helped the Allies win the Second World War, helped the U.S. lead the world in science and technology ever since, and gives us those 3 rules we can all use for innovating faster and better. Are you ready? What happens inside that glass of water is called a phase transition. So I'm going to explain every phase transition in nature to you in 90 seconds. You ready? Every phase transition in nature is a result of 2 competing forces, a tug of war. In the case of the glass of water, one of those forces is called entropy. It's a fancy word. It just means run around and be free. And the other force is called binding energy. It wants to lock every molecule rigidly in place, 2.8 angstroms from its neighbor, not 2.7 or 2.9. Entropy and binding energy. At high temperatures, entropy wins, and as you lower the temperature, boom, right at 32 Fahrenheit, those 2 things cross, and the system, whoosh, the tug of war flips sides, and the system suddenly snaps. Boom, that's a phase transition. The water freezes. Now, what does any of this possibly have to do with teams or companies? That sounds crazy. All people are different, all teams are different, all companies are different. That's true. But so are all liquids. Water is different than coffee, is different than orange juice, yet they all freeze. And so I'll show you why and how that happens inside groups. Anytime you organize a group, you bring together people into a team, a company, even a nation, where there's a mission and a reward system tied to that mission, you have just created 2 competing forces. The first is stake and outcome. The second is perks of rank. Stake and outcome, perks of rank. Here's how that works. Imagine you start a small biotech company like I did, and you have this big exciting goal. Let's develop a new cancer drug. Everybody's stake and outcome is enormous. If that drug works, everybody's a hero and a millionaire. And if it fails, you're unemployed and looking for a new job. What are the perks of rank? Well, you could get a higher base salary or a little bit of a boost in title, but it's kind of irrelevant to the huge stake and outcome. Whoosh. Now imagine you got a much bigger company. Let's say a typical large pharma company, 100,000 people. Well, your stake and outcome is actually really pretty small now. Your little project might move the needle of that company by less than a fraction of a percent. Well, what about the perks of rank? Well, let's say you're at a committee meeting and somebody comes in with, actually it's the same exact project that you were excited about earlier at that small company, but now you say, well, on page 37, I don't think they did this experiment, and on page 82, I don't think they did this thing, and your boss happens to be sitting at the table, and she says, oh yeah, that's right, they didn't do this thing on page 37 or page 82. And then you say, well, I think the industry is really headed in this other direction. They're going in this way. And your boss says, what a coincidence. That's exactly what I think. That is such a coincidence. You said exactly what your boss wants to hear. And her boss is at the table. And that's what she thinks too. And they're both nodding their heads and saying, that young fellow has a head on his shoulders. What just happened? Well, you might get promoted. And it would happen really quickly. It wouldn't take several years like this other project. Your base salary might go up by 30%. You might get all these nice perks of rank. Maybe you get a car or a parking spot. Whew. In other words, in between those 2, the forces tipped. Whoosh! All of a sudden, your incentives go from focusing on projects and outcomes to politics and promotion. That's when the conversation around the water cooler changes. Instead of this is my exciting project and this is how it's going and, here's how we can, it hit some bumps in the road and here's how we can save it, people start talking about their career path and their promotion and about the politics of that. Whoosh! That's when good teams will start to kill great ideas. All this is very different than what you usually hear about culture. And you can think of culture as sort of the patterns of behavior that you see. The molecules are sloshing around or they're totally rigid. You can think of structure as what's underneath. It's hot or it's cold. It drives those patterns of behavior. Inside a company, you have a very political culture. We have a very innovative culture. If you celebrate and reward rank, you're going to get a very political culture. Everybody's shooting their neighbor down to get promoted. If you celebrate and reward intelligent risk-taking, you will get a very innovative culture. And here's why it matters. No amount of singing Kumbaya or asking employees to hold hands and watch 2-hour movies about brotherhood, as anyone who's been inside a large company knows, is going to do much to change culture. Just like yelling at the molecules in a block of ice isn't going to melt that block of ice. But a small change in temperature can get the job done. A small change in temperature can melt steel. Now, where this gets really interesting is that once we understand this transition, we can begin to manage it. For example, when it snows overnight, what do you sprinkle on your sidewalk? Salt. Why? Because it makes the molecules less sticky, more likely to slosh around. It just lowered the binding energy. So what happens is when you wake up in the morning and step on your sidewalk, you wet your shoe in a puddle instead of slipping on the sidewalk and ending up in the hospital. Once you understand this transition, once you understand these dynamics, you can begin to tease out those small changes in structure you can make that give you more innovative teams and companies. So now it sounds like a nice metaphor so far, but you can actually work this out in a lot more detail. You can write down an equation that captures this. What are the incentives and how does it change at a certain size of company? Everything will whoosh, flip, and then what are the control parameters? How do you adjust that? Just like what is the equivalent of sprinkling salt in water? Those are the small things you can change. But what I want to talk about is a really big problem. And that is that there are two phases. In one of those phases, everybody will, when you're small and the stake in outcome is really high, everybody will roll up their sleeves to nurture these crazy ideas, these loonshots. Whoosh, you flip. The other phase, everybody will talk about what works well in a committee meeting. The franchises, loonshots and franchises. For example, let's say the 27th James Bond movie. Why? Well, what do you need for a James Bond movie? You say, well, I got a bad guy, a fast car, a damsel in distress, a couple bad jokes. Boom! We have a movie. Or the 28th iPhone. But not something like giant turtles that love pizza. In other words, here you focus on the franchises, the stuff that will do well in committee meetings, and you'll miss the stuff here, the loonshots. Why is this such a problem? Because you need both. Last year I was on a nuclear submarine with the admiral responsible for transforming the Navy for the 21st century. And we were having exactly this discussion. Imagine you are on a nuclear submarine and you are deep underwater, a couple hundred miles from shore. You don't want to start hearing clanking noises in your engine. That's your franchise. That's your core. You need that to operate on time, on budget, on spec with discipline. At the same time, you don't want to be surprised by a new kind of torpedo. That's the crazy new stuff that if you don't figure it out, your competitors will. So for companies, it's a matter of P&L, but for national security and military, it's a matter of life or death. How do you balance the core and the new? And the reason this is such a problem is that a system can never be in two phases at the same time. If you have this loonshot crazy idea phase and this focusing on the core phase, a system just can't be in two phases at the same time. For example, with this glass of water, what does it possibly mean for the water to be solid and liquid at the same time? It's impossible. And if you try to do it, all you'll get is slush. So what's the answer? The ice cube, the garden hoe, and the heart. And here's what I mean by those things. Those are the three tools that get you to the one exception to the rule. There's one exception to the rule that a system can't do these two things at the same time, the core and the new. And that's right on the cusp of a phase transition, right at 32 Fahrenheit. If you bring a bathtub to 32 Fahrenheit, here's what will happen. You will get blocks of ice and pools of liquid, and they will coexist in equilibrium. And here is the single most important point. They don't just sit there. There are molecules melting off a face of the ice, swimming into the liquid, and there are molecules in the liquid swimming next to the ice and locking on and freezing, and they're constantly going back and forth. In physics and science, that's called dynamic equilibrium. And that's the key. as we'll see. So let me tell you what I mean by the ice cube, the garden hoe, and the heart. Those are the tools to get us to life at 32 Fahrenheit, to the balance between the core and the new, the rigid, the discipline, the focus, the execution, and the wild, crazy idea. The ice cube means bridge your artists and your soldiers. Bridge the core and the new. By the artists, I mean those who are working on the new, those who are trying to do wild new stuff that changes how people see the world. And by the soldiers, I mean those who are focused on time, on budget, on spec, consistently to customers. You need both, and the problem is those two groups generally don't understand each other and generally don't like each other. The group that's making the money rarely likes the group that's spending the money, and vice versa. Artists and soldiers. It comes down to language. For example, the English word risk. One word, 4 letters. You'd think it means the same thing to everybody, but it doesn't. To a soldier, risk is a terrible thing. You don't want to have a lot of risk when you're putting on a parachute. To an artist, risk is a great thing. If you tell an artist, well, you've taken all the risk out of your art, that's a horrific insult. If you tell a soldier, well, you've really de-risked that battlefield situation, that's a fantastic compliment. 2 stars. Artists and soldiers, different languages. I think of it now as the beautiful baby problem. The artists like to see their new creations, whether you're a biologist in the lab or an engineer designing some beautiful new algorithm or a guy designing a coffee machine. It's this beautiful baby full of potential, wonderful. The soldier sees a shriveled up raisin covered in vomit and poop. Beautiful baby, vomit and poop. Beautiful baby, vomit and poop. That's the problem. And here's the thing. You want them to do that. You want that tension. You want to lean into that conflict. If your artists aren't really excited about their new stuff, you have a far bigger problem. If your soldiers aren't looking for the flaws and how to fix it and make it work on time, you have a really big problem too. If a soldier comes, if a sales guy goes knocking on a customer's door and says, here, sir, here's your television. Television, I ordered a toaster. You're not going to have a business for very long. You need both, but they don't understand and they don't like each other. Anybody who's worked in IT knows that if, when somebody comes over with a new tool, the sales guy says, just, get away from me. The sales guy's job is to make phone calls and make sales. Every hour, he makes 15 sales calls, he gets 3 leads, he gets 1 closed deal, pays the rent. So every hour that he's not making sales calls and listens to some crazy new idea, which probably won't work, is money out of his pocket. Which brings us to the garden hoe. If you are a leader, a manager, garden hoe is about be a gardener, not a Moses. Meaning, this myth that you read about in business magazines where there's this great hero that stands on top of a mountain and raises his or her staff and anoints the chosen project, the holy loonshot, is just a myth. That's not how the truly great leaders have led. They understand that the key to innovation isn't in the supply of new ideas. You could put 10 people in a room for an hour with a stack of Post-its and then get 1,000 new ideas. Some of them will be good. The key to innovation is the transfer to the field. That's where innovation fails. It fails in the transfer. Be a gardener, not a Moses, means manage the transfer, not the technology. It's not your job to pick out, say this one is great or this one is great. Your job is to focus on managing the transfer between these two groups. You create a lot of experiments here, and let's say new ideas and new approaches, and then you manage the transfer into the field to see how well it works. But even more importantly, you manage the transfer back. Number 2 is gardener, be a gardener, not a Moses, manage the transfer, not the technology. Number 3 might be the most important. The heart. Learn to love your artists and soldiers equally. Love your artists and soldiers equally. I'll give you an example of that. A less famous example of an ultra-famous icon. Steve Jobs, when he first started Apple, saw himself as this ultimate artist, and he called him, his group working on the Macintosh, the Pirates, and everybody else who was working on the next generation Apples, he called them bozos, regular army. Well, those bozos were bringing in 95% of the revenue of the company. They didn't like that very much, and so they got plastic buttons, with pictures of Bozo the Clown with a red sash going through it, and they said, we're not bozos. But the hostility he created between those two buildings was so great that the road between those two buildings was called the DMZ, the Demilitarized Zone. And pretty soon, everybody started leaving on both sides. And when the Macintosh launched in 1984, it was a great publicity campaign, but it was a flop as a product. It was too expensive, it overheated, it was underpowered, and people didn't buy it after a while. And Apple was sort of rapidly headed for bankruptcy, and Jobs was justifiably asked to leave. In other words, he didn't love his artists and soldiers equally. He hated the soldiers, and he put them down. It was exactly the opposite of what you want to do, and he actually kept doing that at his next two companies. But when he finally got back to Apple 12 years later, he had learned to love his artists and soldiers equally. What did he do? One of the first things he did was he promoted a guy named Johnny Ive, sort of a legendary designer who created many of the beautiful Apple products that we all take for granted today. But the second thing he did is hire a guy from Compaq Computer whose nickname there was the Attila the Hun of inventory. His name was Tim Cook. And he led not by, I'm the Moses on the mountain, this is my idea, but he led by managing the touch and the balance between those two groups. He loved them equally. And when he died, who took over? It wasn't the ultimate artist, Johnny Ives, the way Jobs saw himself. It was the ultimate soldier, Tim Cook. So now I want to show you how these applied in a time of great national crisis, when the world's freedom was at stake. Brink of World War, January of 1939. Had there been prediction markets, and I want you to forget everything you thought you knew about how the Allies won World War II. Had you been there in person in January of 1939, you would have placed your odds on this organization, this startup organization in Western Europe called Nazi Germany, to win. Why? Well, they had these things called U-boats, submarines, that looked ready to strangle the Atlantic, and they were shooting down ships faster every month than the Allies could build them, which is exactly what happened. Number two, they had the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, outclassed any other air force in existence, and they looked ready to bomb Western Europe into submission, which they did within a matter of weeks, just 1 year later. And number three, in January of 1939, two German scientists discovered something called nuclear fission, splitting the atom, which put Hitler within reach of the most dangerous weapon ever created by man. So you would have been right to place your odds on Nazi Germany. What happened? A man named Vannevar Bush, who was Dean of Engineering at MIT, had understood that the U.S. was falling behind. He'd heard about it from fleeing Jewish refugees, and he was kind of an organizational genius. In addition to being an incredible inventor, he started a small company called Raytheon, invented the first analog computer. He decided to quit his job, move to Washington, and he talked his way into a meeting with Franklin Roosevelt, President Franklin Roosevelt. It was a 10-minute meeting, probably changed the course of the war more than any other meeting. He told FDR, there's a war coming and we're going to lose this war. The Army and the Navy are too far behind Nazi Germany, and they'll never catch up in time. And he handed FDR a single sheet of paper. On that paper was 3 bullets in the middle, and it said, I want you to authorize a new group inside the federal government that will report only to me, and I will report only to you, and I will mobilize the nation's scientists for war. FDR looked him up and down, read it, signed it, okay, FDR, go ahead. And he did. What happened? Over the next 3 years, exactly as Bush and many of his colleagues thought, the U-boats became the single greatest threat of the war. Hitler and the head of the German Navy, Karl Dönitz, finally understood that this is how they were going to win the war. Why? Because there was one nation left in Western Europe called Great Britain, and Great Britain is an island. No oil. What do tanks need? Oil. What do planes need? Oil. What do trucks need? Oil. No oil, no war. By the spring of 1943, England was down to 3 months of oil. No oil, no war. The Allies were facing a completely different world map, a united Nazi Republic of Western Europe. So what happened? Not actually what you can read about in popular histories or see great movies like Imitation Game, which, by the way, is a great movie, and Benedict Cumberbatch is an awesome actor, and Keira Knightley is terrific. But that movie is based on a lie. Code breaking had nothing to do, breaking the German Enigma machine, the Imitation Game, had nothing to do with winning the Battle of the Atlantic, defeating the U-boats. Why? Because left out of that movie and most popular histories is the fact that B. Deinz, German intelligence in Berlin, had been breaking nearly every British code and reading every intercepted naval traffic between 1938 and 1943. So as soon as the British broke the code, the Germans would read about it, move their U-boats, and sink the ships. What really happened is this. When England was down to 3 months of oil, running on fumes, the first B-24 Liberator bombers sailed out over the Atlantic with 2 new technologies from Vannevar Bush and his group of loons. The first was long-range radio navigation. Crazy idea. Let's build radio antennas all around the Atlantic and put a special decoder device so that planes can instantly tell where they are in the Atlantic Ocean, this giant ocean, and ships can radio for help and the planes can go find them. It was the forerunner of GPS. But the second and the most important one was something called microwave radar. It allowed the pilots to see those U-boats, day or night, fog or shine. And they began sinking U-boats, like shooting fish in a barrel. Within the first 4 weeks, they'd sunk more U-boats than they had in the entire prior war. Within the first 90 days, Hitler lost 1/3 of the entire operational U-boat fleet. May 20th, 1943, Karl Dönitz, the head of the German Navy, sends a radio blast across the Atlantic. All remaining U-boats withdraw. The Battle of the Atlantic has been lost. And the lanes were cleared to resupply England, and the lanes were cleared for an Allied invasion of Europe. And from that point on, as Churchill and Roosevelt knew, and as some of Hitler's generals knew, the outcome of the war was inevitable. What was it that Vannevar Bush did? Number one, the ice cube. He understood that you needed both in the military. You needed the tight discipline and execution and structure and hierarchy if you want to make millions of guns and thousands of ships and thousands of tanks at high reproducibility, at very high consistency. You need that tight discipline. He understood that you can't change that culture, but you can change the structure. Number two, the garden hoe. People said, oh, Mr. Bush, you're this great scientist. Some of your inventions must have been very important. He said, not a single one of my inventions made any difference. His job was just to bridge that divide, and it went 2 ways. When they invented the microwave radar and they tested it by going up in a building in Boston and having a dummy U-boat in the harbor and seeing it for the first time, Bush said, and his team said, wow, this is fantastic. We're going to win the war. Gave it over to the Army Air Force, and nothing happened. Why? Soldiers will always reject the new, and that's totally normal. Their job is to reduce risk. Anything new is extra risk. So Bush got in the plane with some of the generals and said, listen, look at how much you can see. And they came back and boom, it was in the planes. It got in the planes. So he helped get the idea this way. But that's only half the battle. It's just as important to get the feedback back. Anybody in IT knows project never works well the first time, and you have to iterate many times. But you know what? The soldiers are busy. There's no incentive for them. They don't care. They just want to get you away from their desk so they can get back to their job, to what they get glory for, what will get them promoted, not bringing you feedback. Nothing happened after the first 6 months. So Bush went back to his scientists in Boston and said, listen, you guys go get in the plane and find out what's going on. And I said, no, we're scientists in Boston. Like, what are you talking about? Get in planes and fly over a war zone. He said, just go. They went and they saw, once they got in the cockpits, that the pilots, when they were flying at 300 miles an hour and getting shot at, didn't have the time or energy to fiddle with the 12 switches on the black boxes that the scientists had just given them. In other words, the technology worked, but the user interface was lousy. Scientists went back to the lab and invented this thing called the PPI display, which, if you've ever seen movies, that's the sweeping white line that you get on radar, and you see the little enemies as white dots. That was spring of 1943. And finally, what did he do? That was the ice cube, and that was the garden hoe. He bridged the divide. Man is the transfer, not the technology. Number 3 was the heart. He loved his artists and soldiers equally. So many scientists before Bush had understood that the U.S. was falling far behind. But their attitude was they'd meet with a politician or a general. I'm a professor at Harvard or Yale or MIT or whatever, and, where'd you go to school? They might not have said it, but they were thinking it. And what was their impact? 0. Bush, on the other hand, loved the military men. He later in life said, I've enjoyed working with military men more than any other group that I've worked with in the past, academics or politicians. The last one's a low bar, but he loved his military men. He understood why they were so important. He enjoyed working with them. He respected them just as much as the scientists. And that's why he succeeded. The ice cube, the garden hoe, and the heart. End of 1944, FDR's won his last election. He calls Van Bush into his office. He says, what's going to happen to this system you invented for innovating astonishingly fast after the war is over? Bush said, well, it's going to fall flat on its face. Science is going to go whoosh, down the toilet, just like it did for the last 20 years. FDR said, I want you to figure out a way that we could use this system, these ideas that you invented, to help the United States, to create new jobs, to improve health, to improve well-beings. And so Vannevar Bush did that. He came up with this ideas for the national research infrastructure of the United States. And that grew into the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, DARPA, which gave us GPS, the internet, the chemotherapy cure for cancer, the laser, even the transistor. Much of the personal computer industry came out of many of those federal research projects. In other words, that's how understanding what happens inside that glass of water helped the Allies win the Second World War, helped the U.S. lead the world in science and technology ever since, and gives all of us 3 rules that we can use to innovate faster and better. Now, those are kind of tip of the iceberg ideas. There's a lot more to it about translating it in practice.